Okay, let us begin. Hello everybody. Welcome to the 11th presentation in the Punjab and the World History, Politics and Migrations series, which explores the modern history of the Punjab as well as Punjabi migrations in a global and transnational context. For those who are new to this program, the series features scholars from a range of disciplines, such as historians who work on aspects of the Sikh Empire, scholars of colonial Punjab, and those who work on various aspects of colonial history. We learned a bit about the state of the field and military history, histories of Amritsar, and various other topics, aspects of migration to Canada and North America, and this week, popular culture, and then next week, on visual culture. Before we begin, I would like to acknowledge with respect the Lekwungen peoples on whose traditional territory the university stands, and the Songhees, Esquimalt, and Wasanich peoples whose historic relationships with the land continue to this day. For those of you who don't know me, my name is Neilesh, and I'm the convener of the series and the host of the program, and I teach South Asian and global history at the University of Victoria here in British Columbia in Canada. And in keeping with our traditions, the speaker today will speak for the first part of the program for approximately 30 to 35 minutes, followed by an open Q&A moderated by myself. And the chat is disabled, so I'd ask you to please hold any questions or comments you have until the end, and I'll ask you to use the digital hand raise function, and I will call on everybody in order. And just so everybody knows, the program here is being recorded, so I will ask everyone to please make sure that your audio is off during the presentation. Onward to the speaker. It is a great pleasure to introduce our speaker for today, Dr. Anjali Gera Roy, professor in the Department of Humanities and Social Sciences at the Indian Institute of Technology in Kharagpur, where she has taught courses in language, literature, and cultural studies for over 2 decades. Her numerous publications include several books, edited, co-edited, as well as single-authored books. One of her co-edited books is edited with Nandi Bhatia, titled Partitioned Lives, Narratives of Home, Displacement, and Resettlement. And one of her single-authored monographs is Bhangra Moves, From Ludhiana to London and Beyond. She has been researching the transnational flows of Bollywood cinema for the last several years and has published numerous works in that field as well. She has held fellowships across the world in places from Mysore and Canberra to Calgary here in Canada, Singapore, Sydney, and here at the University of Victoria as well. She is the president of the Indian chapter of the Association for the Study of Australasia in Asia, and a life member of the Indian Association for Commonwealth Literature and Language Studies and the Indian Association for Canadian Studies. At this time, I would like to turn the Zoom floor over to Professor Roy for her talk, Performing Punjab, Punjabi and Punjabiat.
Thank you, Dr. Bose, Neilesh, for this very generous introduction, and good evening to all of you. I would also like to thank you for inviting me to speak at the Global South Colloquium. I've been listening to the lectures, even though I was not able to attend them live. I've been listening to the recordings, and it seemed to me like we've been talking about Punjab. I was very happy to see Punjab as a theme of the colloquium, but it appeared to me that we've been talking about Punjab over different eras, and there were some very, very interesting and stimulating takes on different phases of Punjab's history. But most of the speakers seem to take Punjab for granted, as if it was, everyone knew where Punjab is, what is Punjab. So I begin by asking the question, what is Punjab? Where is Punjab? What do we mean by this region, which we call Punjab? And one should begin with, whenever one talks about a region, there is a geographical aspect. It's territoriality, if I may call it, place as bounded. That's the most, basic sense in which we refer to any region. But whenever we speak of any place, it's also, there is an element of imagining in that place, apart from its geospatial contours. There's also the aspect of imagining, and that's the aspect that has fascinated me, which I spoke about in my book, Imperialism and Sect Migration, where I proposed the idea of place itself as mobile. And I suggested that given the fluid boundaries, the lack of fixity in the boundaries of Punjab, which seemed to be moving all the time, which seemed to be shifting all the time, I proposed the idea of free-flowing cartography of Punjab, which seems to be moving all the time, so this notion of the space itself as unstable, as moving, as amorphous. But when one looks at this space as amorphous or unstable, I think a distinction needs to be made between the geographical bioregion, the spatiality of the space, but also the political administrative unit, which is Punjab. And I think that most of us, when we're talking about Punjab, we're talking about the political administrative unit, which is, unfortunately, we always think of the idea of modern Punjab, the British Punjab, and the region is mapped on that political administrative unit. But there seems to be a geographical core in this imagining of Punjab. Whenever we think of the region, it's somewhere in the northwest of India. And the rivers seem to play a very important role in this geographical role. The geographical core. Now, the rivers, the land of 5 rivers, as Punjab was called by the British. Panch is 5 in Persian, and Ab is water. So Panch, 5 rivers, 5 waters, so the land of 5 rivers. But I think the rivers seem to be central to this imagining, but we need to know how many rivers, because there seems to be some kind of discrepancy between the number of rivers around which the region is imagined. And if we go back to the earliest references in the Rig Veda, which mentions 7 rivers with their Sanskrit names, all the rivers, the names which are familiar to us, they have their Sanskrit names, and the grammarian Panini also mentions these 7 rivers. And the region is called Vaika, which is the land of the outsiders. So from 7, we move on to the 6, where we include the Indus. So at some point, there's the 6 rivers. And the term 5 rivers is mentioned in the Sanskrit epic Mahabharata, where there's a reference to Panchanath, the 5 rivers. And this is again the region which was referred to in the Rig Veda. But sadly, there's a jump. So from this prehistory or the epic history, we come to medieval history. And this is the first time the term Punjab is used. This is during the Mughal era and much later the Mughal era, because during the Mughal period also, there's the Subai Lahore. I understand, because I'm not a historian, so I depend on the work of other historians. And I recall a very renowned professor telling me that there was no Punjab until the Mughal period. And even then there were just provinces. There was the province of Multan and Lahore, but the name Punjab wasn't used. So we find the first usage of the term when Lahore is expanded, the province is expanded to include the Doabas of the 5 rivers, and the name Punjab is used in Tarikh-e Sher Shahi by Akbar. So during this time, it covers the areas from the river Indus to Satluj. I did not name the rivers at all. I assume they were known, but we have the 5 rivers and from the Indus, Jhelum, Chenab, Ravi, Vyas, and Satluj. So this region between the Mughal Empire during the Mughal period, the Subai Lahore covered these areas, and then from there we moved to Maharaja Ranjit Singh's empire. There was a brilliant paper by presentation by Priya Atwa. I think it was the second or the first lecture in the series where she went into Maharaja Ranjit Singh's empire, the Sarkari Khalsa. And we find that, okay, what is amazing is that the geography of the rivers on which the region is mapped, sometimes they're included and sometimes they're not included. So I understand that during the Maharaja's reign, the parts of Satluj were not included. So the territory is not always, the political unit is asymptotic or does not intersect with the rivers during certain periods or does not include all the rivers. So during Maharaja Ranjit Singh's time, he calls himself the master of Punjab, but also includes regions like Multan, and we have parts of Kashmir, parts of Afghanistan, and he calls himself the king of all these regions. So when the British come, the entire region, which was Maharaja Ranjit Singh's territory, now that becomes the British Punjab, the British province of Punjab, and this is the time when the term the land of 5 rivers is used. However, in addition to the area which was annexed by Maharaja Ranjit Singh, which wasn't initially a part of Punjab, the British Punjab includes what is present-day Pakistan and also Indian Punjab, which includes not only the present state of East Punjab, but also parts of Haryana, Himachal Pradesh, Rajasthan, as far as Delhi. So now this province of this region of Punjab, as we understand it in the contemporary sense, we really map it on the British Punjab, British province of Punjab, which was divided into 5 administrative regions. This is important because this is another map of British Punjab, and this is the June 3rd declaration of the partition. I haven't gone into the subsequent maps because, so what I said was free-flowing cartographies. What I meant was that how the boundaries of Punjab, even of the geographical, the boundaries which signify the geographical region of Punjab, they seem to be moving all the time. And after partition, again, the region is, first we have the amalgamation of princely states with what is East Punjab until 1954, and then in 66, East Punjab is again divided, and parts of it, part of it becomes Haryana, and parts of it go to Rajasthan and Himachal. So this whole amorphous boundaries of the region, which shows that place itself is not static; it seems to be changing. It's a very postmodern formulation, and the new ideas of space and place proposed by geographers like Doreen Massey and now on Akhil Gupta and James Ferguson, that how the spatiality of place becomes disconnected and how the territoriality of space becomes decoupled from the imagining of the space. And that's my interest. So in Anshu Malhotra and Farina Meer's introduction to the excellent book, Punjab Reconsidered, they talk about the territoriality of Punjab and talk about the 3 aspects of the territoriality. One is the historical, the second is the notion of the extended Punjab, and the third is the one where they talk about the imagined Punjab, which is my space of, in the space in which I work, where the imagining, how Punjab is imagined, is more important than the geographical territory itself, or even extended Punjab, even though the imagining of Punjab goes to the extended Punjab. So when they talk about the extended Punjab and they talk about imagining, they are talking about the extension of Punjab to the diasporas, for instance, Canada and the various Punjabi diasporas across the world, but they haven't included the internal diasporas because there are little Punjabs all across India as well. So there is the need to extend the boundaries of Punjab, not only to the diasporas, but also to little Punjabs dispersed, scattered all across India. And in the imagining of Punjab, which again they talk about, it's not only the Nanak Plaza, which I came across in Toronto, and when I was in Vancouver, there was evidence of Punjab everywhere in Surrey, in Vancouver. But even within India, how the region is imagined by people who've never been there or who've left it behind. So this geographical region itself gets constructed, reconstructed, because it exists only in the memories of the people. When one thinks of the partition cities or the memories of survivors who were forced to migrate from those beloved cities, the cities don't have, the present cities don't have any correspondence with the cities they remembered. So it's only a city which exists in the memory. And for the generations that follow, it's not even those remembered cities, but the places of settlement, like in the volume Imagine Punjab, Punjabi, Punjabiat, there are essays where one talks of British Punjabis, or for them, parts of Britain like South Hall or Soho Road, they become Punjab. And that is true of even of people of the Punjabi diasporas dispersed across India, the second generation or the third generation or even the fourth generation. Where is Punjab? So it seems that the imagining is more important than the real region of Punjab for this imagined imagining of Punjab. So from Punjabi, I move on to Punjabi. And since my training is in literary studies, so this is an area where I don't need slides because I have worked on this topic not only with Punjabi and other languages of Punjab, but also with Hindi and Urdu. And the same issue crops up when one talks about the languages spoken in the Punjab region. So when I talk about Punjabi, we're talking about who are Punjabis and what is Punjabi, what is the language Punjabi, and who are Punjabis. I'll come to who are Punjabis later, but let's begin with what is this language called Punjabi. Now, it seems to me, and it came to me very late in life, because I identified myself as a Punjabi, but very much later, I came to know that the language which was spoken in my home was not really Punjabi, because now it has a new name. So it's called Saraiki. So there are many Punjabis. There's not a single Punjabi. There are many Punjabis, and that history, that reason for the many Punjabis goes back to the histories of the annexations of different regions in Punjab, which I spoke about earlier. So when we talked about Maharaja Ranjit Singh, we talked about Multan, how Multan remained a separate province in his kingdom, and so did Bahawalpur and many other parts of what later came to be part of Punjab. So when the British annexed Punjab after the Anglo-Sikh Wars, many of these regions, along with their languages, were classified. The regions were included in Punjab, and the languages were classified as dialects of Punjabi. So there is this whole controversy, very contentious issues surrounding the debate on Punjabi, particularly in Pakistan, because there's a secessionist, separatist Saraiki movement where the Saraiki-speaking regions of South Punjab are saying that we've always had an independent history, which is independent from that of Punjab and Saraiki, the languages which they have classified under the umbrella term Saraiki. They were never part of Punjabi. So I don't have time to go into that, but what I'm saying is that Punjabi is not a single thing. There are many Punjabis. Now, the second part, which is very important, is that Punjabi, if we think of it, I look at Punjabi as a speech community, because when one is talking about Punjabi and people who identify themselves as speakers of Punjabi, they do not necessarily share the script, or they do not know how to read and write Punjabi. So they might be able to speak Punjabi, but they are not able to read and write Punjabi for various reasons, which I'll come to next. But what I want to say is that even among the speech community, which is spread across between the two Punjabs and also in the diasporas within India and outside India, even in this speech community, the number of speakers of Punjabi are dwindling over the years, not only in Pakistan, but also in India. So in Pakistan, it's surprising that even though it's the language of the dominant majority, Punjabi is not spoken anymore. So there's a lot of disquiet about the dwindling number of speakers in Pakistani Punjab, in West Punjab, and Indian Punjab also. The number of speakers of Punjabi who identify themselves as Punjabis, including a person like myself, who has always entered Punjabi as my mother tongue. But I don't speak in my home. Punjabi is not spoken or was not spoken after a certain time. And again, the reasons for this not speaking Punjabi go back to the inferiorization of Punjabi, the peasantization of Punjab and Punjabi during a certain period when Punjab and Punjabi became associated with a loud, rustic, uncouth culture. So there was this dissociation or disidentification with Punjabi, which dates back to the British period when Punjabi was inferiorized, or Punjab was considered as a rural, as a village, and Punjabis as villagers. But it got aggravated and further accentuated when, after the partition of India, where particular groups of Punjabis, like the Muslims and Hindus, the Muslims in Pakistan and the Hindus in India, Hindu Punjabis in India and the Muslim Punjabis in Pakistan, due to the need to assimilate into the nation, national language, which was Urdu in the case of Pakistan and Hindi in the case of Hindu Punjabis in India, there's a distancing from language, and the language is on the verge of disappearing both in India and Pakistan, particularly over the generations. So fortunately, it's a Sikh community the world over which has valiantly held on to Punjabi. And when we think of the speakers of Punjabi, it's largely the Sikhs who continue to speak Punjabi wherever they are in the world. But I was sorely disappointed in my last visit to Lucknow, where I found even the young Sikhs were not speaking Punjabi, they were speaking Hindi. And I understand that the fourth generation Sikhs, even in Bombay, do not speak Punjabi. They speak either Hindi or English. So now when we talk about this division of speech community, we find that Punjabi has become the exclusive language of the Sikhs. And that's why there is an increasing synonymy and confusion between Sikhi and Punjabi, which I'll come to later. But let's now move on to script. So what role did script play in the division of Punjab and in the so-called composite or the syncretic identities of Punjab? So we have Paul Brass's authority to talk about how the split was engineered with the birth of Islamic nationalisms, followed by Sikh and Hindu nationalisms, and how Hindu, Sikh, and Islamic organizations, the role they played in splitting the community. So I understand that Punjabi was never the official language of Punjab and different periods, even during, so it was Persian, which was the official language, and the script which was used by all the communities was Indo-Persian. So even during Maharaja Ranjit Singh's period, where he encouraged Punjabi, the official language remained Persian. and the script was Indo-Persian script. So during the British, the official language was Urdu, and the script was again Indo-Persian. So how the script gets divided, that's one. One is the instrumental division, that the males need to work, so they are taught Indo-Persian, they taught Shamukhi, whereas the women, because they need to preserve tradition, they need to study Gurmukhi, which goes back to Guru Angad's time, because it's been there since for a long time. But how many people, and only the Sikhs can read and write Gurmukhi, whereas the Hindu women were encouraged to learn Devanagari. So the scriptural divide between Devanagari, Urdu, Persian-Arabic script, and Gurmukhi takes place, and how it is used, it becomes complicit in the division of various nationalisms and in the birth of the nations. So how a language and a script which is common to all people, how it becomes symbolic of nations. So Urdu becomes equated with Muslims and Pakistan, and Punjabi with Gurmukhi with Sikhs, and Hindi and Devanagari with Hindus and with Hindustan. So that's a very sad story, and that's the reason why I do not think there is a very long history of literature in Punjabi, which is again transcribed both in Gurmukhi. When one looks at the textual tradition of the Sikhs, there is a tradition in Gurmukhi which dates back to the Gurus. And then there is a parallel tradition of script in Indo-Persian, which goes back to Baba Farid. Now, how many of us, now when you don't have that facility with the script, and when these texts which are told are the common texts of all Punjabis, how many Punjabis are familiar with these texts in the written version? That's very important for us. So one is familiar with the text in the spoken versions, in the narrated versions, but not one is not able to read these texts because of the division of the script. So that's why I come to the third part of Punjabiat, which is Punjabiat. So when we talked about Punjabiat, what is Punjabiat and how is it performed? That's why I use the term performed, because it's not, according to now, Punjabiat, again, like Punjab, is a very fuzzy, very amorphous, very elusive notion, which roughly translates as Punjabiness, or Punjabi identity, or the spirit of Punjab. And like all romanticized essences, which are often primordial, one finds it very difficult to define this Punjabiat. So one talks about the spirit of Punjab, which is shared by people all across the world, all Punjabis across the world. And we have some definitions proposed by Professor Preetam Singh, for instance, who considers language, religion, and region as script as very important issues around which Punjabiat is constructed. And then we have Alicia Ayers, who talks about how the Punjabiat movement really started in the 1990s in Punjab by the dominant group where the Punjabis are dominant, and how it is used for political gains. So I won't have time to go into that, but I borrow Anshu Malhotra and Farina Mir's definition of Punjabiat, which is the emotional attachment to describe the sentiment of belonging or attachment to Punjab, and which is the foundation of shared cross-religious, cross-caste, cross-culture. So this is the definition which seems to appeal to me in the understanding of Punjabiat. And I privilege, rather than speech or literature or religion, which has been used in various ways of defining Punjabiat, I look at the performing traditions. And when I talk about performance, I'm talking about the performing arts as well as performativity, in the sense Goffman and Butler use it, and how is this Punjabiat performed. So as I said, because because Punjabis are essentially a speech community, and the literary texts are not so important, or the textual tradition or the language itself is not so important in performing this Punjabiat. It's music, dance, what is called the space of leisure. It's music, dance, song, where the Punjabi is shared. In the next few minutes, how many minutes do I have? Because I have the slides. Do I have 5 minutes? Yes.
Yes.
Okay. So this is something which I have spoken about for so long. So 5 minutes are enough for me. So when I talk about producing Punjabi through performance, I'm essentially talking about my work on Bhangra. And as Neilesh mentioned, there is the book, Bhangra Moves from Ludhiana to London and Beyond, where I talk about Bhangra Nation. I propose the idea of Bhangra Nation, and we talk about how this Bhangra Nation is a space for the performing of Punjabiat for people across all divides, across the divides of religion, across the divides of caste, which is problematic, which I have spoken about, but across nations and across nationalities also. So let's quickly run through the history of this production of Punjabi regional identity or Punjabiat or Punjabiness through Bhangra over after partition. So we speak about how Bhangra is reinvented in 1954, and we have these images of the first Punjabi Bhangra team, the Pepsi team as it was called, and how this marginalized Punjabi dance genre called Bhangra becomes important in the production of post-partition Punjabi regional identity within East Punjab, the Indian Punjab. And slides don't seem to be. Yeah, okay. And then we have a big jump from 54 to 85 and 90s. In the mid 80s, there's this whole Bhangra revival in the UK, spearheaded by second, third generation British Punjabi youth in UK, where it becomes very important in the production of British Asian identity. And then it circulates across the world, and Asian identity is produced through Bhangra. But as I've argued in the essay I shared with the group, is that it's not just British Asian, because it kind of collapses with British Punjabi identity, and it not only turns Asian cool, but it also turns Punjabi cool. So I've named the people who are at the vanguard of this movement, and we have the picture of Bachi Indian, but it starts much before that. And in India, we have a same revival happening in India in 79 with Gurdas Maan. He appears on Doordarshan Jalandhar in 79, and in 1980 he appears in Doordarshan Delhi. And that becomes the Bhangra revival in India. And we have the first Doordarshan star of the 80s. And it's thanks to Gurdas Maan, actually, where Punjabiat is disseminated, because he's appearing on national television. And these are the images of Punjab which are disseminated, produced and disseminated across the nation. And I was amazed when our former director, Professor of IIT Kharagpur, who's a Bengali, and he used to love dancing, and he said, I want to dance to that song. So we said, which dance? He was 88 years old, but he wanted to dance to the Bhangra, and he said, that song he's not a Sardar, he's a Mona. So what I'm saying is that this is how it percolated, to the national consciousness as well. And from Gurdas Maan, we come to the Lian Mehndi, where in the 90s, by 90s, we know that Bhangra became part of global popular culture, and it becomes, there is the circulation of global Punjabiat when Bhangra becomes part of global culture, but it enters Bollywood through this, through the turban Sikh, the Lian Mehndi. When he performs, the Lian Mehndi is already a sensation. And Amitabh Bachchan, the big B, is trying to make a comeback in Hindi cinema after the earlier flops. and he comes back, and because the Lail Mehendi's album sells 1 million copies in Kerala, which is in the deep south. So this is the first non-Hindi film album which sells like that. And because to boost his career, Amitabh Bachchan dances along with the Lail Mehendi in the song Na 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 Re, and that sets off what is called a Bhangra Bollywood invasion of Bhangra. So now I'm going to talk about where Bhangra Nation has multiple sites of production, multiple producers, multiple consumers, and multiple genres. And in this Bhangra Nation, everyone is welcome. There's the Vilati Bhangra, there's the Punjabi Bhangra, and there's the Desi Bhangra, which is brought in by the Lail Mehendi, and there are the Bollywood Bhangra singers like Sukhwinder, Sonu Nigam, Sudesh Bhosle, and so on. So it enters Bollywood, and we have this whole lot of films, largely not only Amitabh Bachchan films, but a whole lot of films where Bhangra becomes an item number, because if you have a Bhangra number in a film, it sells. So I'm really looking at the twin forces. It's not writing, it's not the textual culture, but it's the folk culture, which is the folk song and the folk dance in Bhangra, which is hybridized with other sounds in UK, and which becomes part of the global popular culture. And then it enters Bollywood. So with the popular culture, both Bhangra and Bollywood, how this Punjabiat is not only produced, but it's consolidated and it's mobilized because of the popularity of these two genres in Indian cinema as well as Bhangra music, that Bhangra becomes the Punjabi. There's a circulation of global Punjabiat, which is again performed by people who identify themselves as Punjabis. So the popular culture plays a very big role in disseminating this and consolidating the Punjabiat. So when we talk about the Bollywood film industry, we know that its Punjabiat has always been very thinly veiled, but it's been dominated by people from Punjab. So when we, particularly after partition, we talk about the cross-border migration, and we have the migration of actors, directors, producers, lyricists, music directors, singers, and so on. I won't have time to name all of them. But Punjabiat is suppressed in genuflection to the myth of the nation in the All India film. So we have all these actors, the Kapoors, Khannas, and Anands and Malhotras, Nishal's and Aroras. We know that we can guess their identity from the surnames, but there are a whole lot of actors I wasn't aware of who also were Punjabi, but because of this whole idea of constructing a national identity, neither the Hindi film hero who is allegedly a North Indian and a Punjabi Khatri was not given a surname in the earlier films, in the Raj Kapoor films and the earlier films. But then when we have the emergence of Punjabiat in the 1990s, because when the Bollywood discovers that there's a big market for Bollywood in the diaspora, which is dominated by Punjabis. So this latent Punjabiat of Bollywood now comes to the fore with the film like Dilwale Dulhaniya Le Jayenge in 1995. And now there's also simultaneously the re-emergence of the Punjabi film industry. So the two film industries meet, and I understand that a film like Mitti Waja Marti, which was a bigger hit in Australia than the Umrao Chan, the remake of Umrao Chan in a particular year. So Punjabiat is being, it's like not just twin attack, but it's kind of three-pronged attack. There is Bhangra, there is Bollywood, and there's also the Punjabi film. So through these three popular cultures, Punjabiat is being circulated, constructed and disseminated across the world to create what is called a global Punjabiat. I conclude by ending by saying that I come back to the imagined notion. For a whole lot of people, this Punjabiat, there is no imagined territory. unlike the Sikhs who have a Pind to return to, or who have a memory of a Pind to return to, Pind is a village, there is a lot of Punjabis who never stepped in Punjab, both in the diasporas and in India. For them, Punjab remains only an imaginary space, and it's neither in the language nor in the nor in reality. The space doesn't exist at all. It's only a mental map. So this is a mental map of a place called Bakar I found. And this is a mental map of a 7-year-old of a town called Bakar. And these memories converge on particular cities or particular regions rather than the entire Punjab. Now, finally, I say that it's not just the, so we have these mental maps of Lailpur. And finally, I would end by saying there is the Punjabiat, of which is not in Punjab at all, but in the Little Punjab, the Gwandas, the neighborhoods of Little Punjabs. And finally, it's not even the space for some, it's just the sensory memories of the tactile memories or the visual memories of which are evoked by objects like the pagri, the embroidery, label on a uniform, or the objects, the manji, the charpoi. So with that, I end my talk and I'm open to questions. I hope there will be some questions. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Professor Roy, for that very rich and layered discussion of so many issues that are both deeply relevant to this class and then also extraordinarily fascinating on their own right. I just want to mention for the students in the class listening and who are out there that when we began the course at the beginning of the semester, some of the issues raised by Professor Roy, indeed those references to Malhotra and Mir, looking at the Punjab from all of these angles where there's no one fixed definition of what either it has referred to in space or what it means in terms of language communities. With your discussion of Seraiki, which was very important and very interesting, the subject of a lot of new work on language and the histories of language, reminds us that there is no one space that we would be able to study called the Punjab, and there's no one reference point to how we can formulate research questions about it, which makes it both wide-ranging, difficult to get a handle on, and also extraordinarily interesting. So I think because of time, I want to make sure that we have time for everybody's questions. As of now, I see 3 people on the list for questions. The first, Sudhir Jain, and then Yishong, and then Rita. So we'll start with Sudhir Jain. You are muted.
Sorry for that. Thank you so much. It was a very, very interesting presentation that you made. I am a Punjabi. My parents hailed from the Pakistan side of Punjab. So my father wrote in the Urdu script. I grew up in Bengal. In a minute, I'll tell you why I come to this. I grew up in Bengal, but we speak Punjabi at home. My children speak Punjabi. So my question is, and in fact, then I went over to Gujarat, so I know Gujarati, and it's incidentally, I am, I have a mastery of 5 languages, Indian languages, which is not unusual for an Indian. The point that you made about Punjabis losing the Punjabi speech in general, I'm curious how that is, because in my relations, we are Jains, not Hindus, not Sikhs. I mean, most of us still speak Punjabi. So I'm wondering, who is this group that you're referring to, where you say that they have stopped speaking Punjabi?
Okay, thank you very much for this. I'm very happy to hear that your family still speaks Punjabi, and even though you lived in Bengal and you grew. Now, this is something I have I've lived in, or I have friends in Little Punjabs all over India, and I think it's my generation with which Punjabi. I did my undergrad in Delhi, and I think none of my friends, my classmates, spoke Punjabi, even though they were Punjabi. And in fact, they would say they pretended that they did not even know Hindi. So they would say, "Thodi bahut aa jati hai." Now also I hear people saying, "Tutti frutti bol lene ha." But I was very happy to see when I was in LSR that it's a Sikh Punjabis who retain Punjabi and who were not embarrassed about speaking it. But I don't know about the home space, but everyone said that they did not know Punjabi. Now, I think there are a lot of factors. There is the conscious retention of Punjabi in certain homes, but I will not talk about my generation because I know in my generation there are still some people who can speak Punjabi. I myself can speak Punjabi even though it was not spoken in my home. And my question really started with my parents. So I asked them, why didn't you speak Punjabi at home? Why did you not speak Punjabi with us? Because now most people who can speak Punjabi in my generation, they can understand, but they can't speak because of the grandparents' influence. So when one lived in the joint family, one was forced. So it was always this intergenerational thing. My grandmother would speak to us in Saraiki, and I would reply to her in Hindi. My parents would speak what is called standard Punjabi, and we would reply to them in Punjabi. So what they gave a very instrumental reason. My parents grew up in Lucknow. They were very small. They were very young when they migrated. They were children. So for them, Lucknow is home. And they said that when they came to Lucknow, they were teased, they were made fun of because they spoke Punjabi. So they wanted, in their understanding, they were trying to give us an advantage by, like today, parents do with making the children speak English. They thought they were giving us an advantage by encouraging us to speak Hindi, because I've heard it from a lot of parents in my parents' generation who talk about how they were lampooned and who were ridiculed because their accent was Punjabi or because they speak Punjabi. So I'm very happy to hear. But in the present generation, I don't think a lot of children can speak Punjabi. And one of the reasons is the intercultural marriages, because a lot of Punjabis have, in my own family, for instance. So the children are very confused. They can understand many languages. Like you said, 5 languages. My son can understand 4 languages or 5 languages, but not fluently, can't speak them fluently. So that's one of the reasons. I don't know whether I've answered your question.
Just a small follow-up, an academic question. Is there any academic study on this issue?
Yeah, there are studies which I did not have time to go into. There is, in the Pakistani side, there's a lot of work on the loss of Punjabi. In my own book on Imagining Punjabiat, there is a brilliant essay where he talks about how Punjabi gets marginalized within Punjab in Pakistan. And in the Indian side, there is not much work. There is a work I came across from Atmajit Singh, and my own work where I speak about why not speaking a language that is mine, where I raise a lot of these issues. But I don't work with numbers. Well, in Atmajit Singh's essays, that was one of the few essays where I came across a number of people who speak. Now, see, there's a confusion there because I have always entered Punjabi as my mother tongue. So if one goes by the census data, I would be considered a speaker of Punjabi, but I don't speak it at home. So there are many like us who have staunchly held on to this idea that we are Punjabis, and we are told by our parents that you must enter Punjabi as your mother tongue. But so the data might not match. So I would like to look at more figures to see. But this will not be mentioned in any of the figures because I myself entered Punjabi as my mother tongue in all the forms I filled up all my life.
Thank you for that. I just want to make one mention about the academic literature. We had read in the class work by Niti Nair on the history of the partition and various interviews that she had done with those who had migrated. And one issue that came up was about those who had migrated to the new state of India after India was created, who sought to hide and to downplay their Punjabi language and identity. And this is one of the people that she interviewed talked about this, and this is a part of her study in that work. Studies called Changing Homelands. And then also in the history of language and linguistics, sociolinguistics, there's a work that gets into this issue of which Punjabi speakers at some times have hidden their Punjabi speech in different places in India and in Pakistan, yet have access to the language in certain forms, just as Professor Roy was mentioning. And in that work that I just mentioned on linguistics, it is also about Seraiki, which has such a great hold on so many people, as Professor Roy mentioned. So as time is moving on, I want to make sure we have other questions. Yishong.
Okay, thank you very much, Roy. My question would be that, as you said, Punjab is not a fixed place. It's always changing in history. Would you say that is kind of a very common thing in India? For example, maybe Bengal and other places are also always changing, and they did not have fixed boundaries and definition in history. And maybe we can also say that, in fact, India had also been changing in history, right? Nowadays, we have a fixed Indian nation state, but in history, it's so always changing. And we can even say that it's kind of a common thing for human being, right? I mean, there is no fixed, for example, there is no fixed Germany in history. There's no fixed Italy, China, Thailand, Vietnam in history, right? So that's my first question. My second thing, the second thing that I want to say is a comment. It's not a question. I would say that the nation building, the partition of India and the nation building of Indian nation and Pakistan is really kind of a very important thing, right? Because I think that with the creation of Indian nation state and the creation of Pakistan nation state, Punjabi people started to think about a Punjabi nation state, right? So before that, even before the even in the 20th century, early 20th century, during the Gandhar movement, Punjabi people did not conceive a Punjabi nation state, right? So basically, I think that the creation of nation state is really a big thing. It changed the rule. It changed the things that it went around in past history. Yeah, that's all. Thank you.
Thank you, Yishong. I completely agree with you. It's not just Punjab, but also other regions within India, like you said. Particularly, I can think of Bengal. In my forthcoming book, we have essays where we have people talking about how Bengal, what was Greater Bengal, included parts of what is Assam, Tripura, Barak Valley in Assam, for instance. It included parts of Tripura. So yes, and India itself, not just India, but as you said, Italy and many other nations, the boundaries, the regions, the boundaries keep changing. And in fact, I was thinking about this yesterday, about like when one is looking at, even within one's own lifetime, one is looking at the boundaries of how the states change, like Uttara, in the neighboring region, there is Jharkhand, and there's Bihar has got divided into Bihar and Jharkhand. And when I went to the Maharaja's house in Jharkhand, the Maharaja of Jharkhand, I found that he had this old map of the region his father owned. And that included parts of Bihar. He said it included parts of Bihar, Bengal, and Orissa. So I completely agree with you. But what struck me about Punjab was the frequency of the changing of boundaries. I think that was important. In every part of the world, there are palimpsests. So you have different empires where the boundaries keep changing, the boundaries of regions, the boundaries of nations, and the boundaries of different parts of the world, it's happened, but the frequency is what struck me. And so it seemed more, the topography seemed a very better way of imagining the region, because when one talks about, that's why, because of these frequencies of boundary crossing or boundary changing, when you ask people to locate their region in Punjab, they don't go to the map of India, or they don't go to the map of Pakistan or Ranjit Singh's map or British map. They just draw the river. I remember my father, my late father, when I asked him the name of his village, he just drew a rough map of the 5 rivers, and he says, see, this is Sindhu Nadi, and this is where my village was, on the Sindhu Nadi. There was no Punjab, there was no Pakistan, there was no India, it was just the Nadi. So it was a frequency of the boundaries changing that interested me, but I completely agree with you about the second state. Yes, it's a nations. So I'm not neither a political scientist nor a historian, so it takes me a longer time to make these connections, because I really work with culture and culture studies and literary studies. But yes, I have drawn on secondary, on others material to show how the the national boundaries, for instance, Akhil Gupta and James Ferguson's work, where the geographers work, where they talk about how the state-centric division of the earth, of the world, which has become so natural to us, it did not exist earlier. So only with the state-centric division of the world, we have the construction of bound borders. But earlier we had boundaries, which were always porous, which were always amorphous, which was always shifting. So yes, the nation states have as a political unit, the nation state has a definite role in this boundary making, the border making, not boundary making.
Yeah, thank you very much.
Thank you for that. Time is running away, but one person had written her question and then she had to leave, but it was a wonderful question and I want to voice it now. It was about Bhangra, and it actually relates to the article that had been assigned for the students for this week, Bhangra Nation, New Meanings of Punjabi Identity in the 21st Century, which was referred to in the talk. And the person who had asked, Rita Damoon, who was a professor here at University of Victoria, asked about the both caste and gendered issues within British Bhangra and the masculinist nature of it. And interestingly enough, I know that in that and other works you have discussed how there's a point where it becomes masculine. It was not like that in earlier eras, but perhaps from the late 20th century, and Gurdas Mann, as you mentioned, and others turn it into a masculine form. But she was asking about that, the masculine and also the caste politics within Bhangra.
Thank you very much, Rita. I know this is something which I have engaged with in my other papers, and I end with that in the book in which I've included the essay Bhangra Nation. Now, this was a very early essay where I think I must confess that I shared that romanticized notion of Punjabiat, which was being circulated at that time when I was writing, when I started thinking about it. And it was a sociologist who brought this to the fore, not the caste issues or the gender issues, but the gap between this constructed Punjabiat, which I was talking about in the Bhangra Nation. It's a very, very pretty thing about how everyone dances the Bhangra and everyone comes together. So what that romanticized idea which Ishtiaq Ahmed talks about, that it's only momentarily bridged during the time of performance. So whenever I've done my field work, I found that I thought this was a space which the Bhangra space united all communities, because I found youth from all communities, all Punjabis, Sikhs, Hindus, and Muslims who would congregate in this space, whether I went to Basement Bhangra or I went to the Hardcore Nights, whichever part of the world I went to, they said, you are Pakistanis, but you're coming to listen to this music. When I asked a youngster, he said, but this is our language, so it doesn't matter which I am. But it doesn't mean that, as Iris has pointed out, that these identities are transcended in real spaces, which is where how I end the book, whether these imagined sense of belonging or Punjabiat can actually help us transcend the boundaries. So now later, as it was actually in Vancouver where I was invited to give a public lecture on Bhangra, where I realized this, because it was at that time these caste issues came up to me, that why is it that Bhangra, which is celebrating a caste identity, in fact, one of the slides where I talk about Gabru Jawan, where in the Punjabi film, it's the Punjabi Jat identity which is being celebrated there. And Nicola Mooney in the University of Fraser Valley has done a lot of work on how Bhangra is a signifier of Punjabi Jat masculinity or the rural imaginary. So how is it that other castes identify? Because when one goes to a club or when one finds people performing Bhangra, one doesn't ask, what is your caste? But how is it that they are identifying the celebration of Jat identity? And the answer came soon on YouTube, because I found this YouTube video which had been uploaded by someone who had a pun on the Put Jattande song and laid it over with Put Chamara De. So, and soon after, Ravish Kumar and Ravish the Awaj was talking about this emergence of the Ravidasya community and the caste narratives which were emerging, where the other communities did not identify with the celebration of Jat Pana in Punjab, in Bhangra. And since even while this book was under publications, these narratives were just about around that time, the narratives were emerging within India. And now you have a whole narrative of songs, Punjabi songs by Chamar, but unfortunately, they only reverse they just displace the Jat with the Chamar, and they talk about how Chamars, it's a celebration of Chamar identity. So the Bhangra space, Rita, is really driven by caste. And as is Punjabiat. I completely agree with you. And gender is another issue which was pointed out to me several times during my presentations, and I hadn't really engaged with it because Bhangra is essentially a masculine form. So in my new work, I talk about Bhangra masculinity and how in fact I'm talking about, it's not published as yet, but I presented it 2 weeks ago, where I talk about the Surrey Jats and the brown boys in Vancouver, in British Columbia, performing their identity in relation to their hypermasculinity, or within quotes, a toxic masculinity in relation to Bhangra, and that was very troubling. So I have been recently going into the gender issue because there is this generic Bhangra, template where there is a reification of women, even in the early songs of Yamla Jat. Songs like Whiskey Di Botal Vargi, songs like that, or even Malkeet Singh, Tera Matha Bada Sona. So either the woman is reified or something worn by the woman is fetishized. So it's always, it's a male gaze, and generically the lyrics are very masculinistic. So and that seems to be a template which is borrowed. And what is disturbing in the music of the Bhangra rappers, like the Honey Singh lyrics, where it gets very disturbing. It is disturbing. Even in my book, I talk about I talk about the categorically vulgar and the fetishization of the female body in Bhangra music videos, even in the lyrics. But in the Bhangra rap, it becomes extremely disturbing, where it is, where Punjabi masculinity, Bhangra masculinity, hyper masculinity is married to rap masculinity, and where the lyrics turn misogynist and violence against women is recommended. So yes, gender is a very important issue which needs to be addressed, which I'm addressing in my new essays. There's gendering dance, which appeared in Religions, and there's this essay which this talk I've been giving on the Surrey Jacks and brown boys constructing their hypermasculinity in relation to Punjabi music, particularly Bhangra music, Bhangra rap music, or even the roots Bhangra of Jazzy B.
Great. Well, thank you so much for that. We are already somewhat over time, and I know that there are many other issues that we could continue discussing for quite some time, but I think that we must now close the program, and I will ask Professor Roy if she has any last words to leave us with at this time.
I would like people to read my new books where I talk about this performed Punjabiat through tactile and sensory memories and through organization of space, where language, neither language nor culture are important, but it's everyday practices which are very important. In my new book on memories and post-memories of the partition of Punjab, which has an early essay which somehow nobody reads. It's called Adarsh Nagar Diyan Galla, which was modified, and where I talked about these performed Punjabiyat, which is through everyday practices. And I think I would like to people to read that. Please feel welcome to email me. I'm more comfortable with email than Facebook and social media. So if anyone can get my email on the IIT website, and feel free. I'll be happy to share my later publications, which I did not give you to read, but if those who are interested. And my new work is again on neighborhoods. So I propose the notion of the Gwanda, and that Punjabiyat which is produced in the Gwanda. Instead of Mohalla, I use the term Gwanda, and I say that though Mohallas are common to all Indians, all parts of India, Gwanda is something which is specifically Punjabi. And I talk about, so it's the intangible aspects which I draw upon when talking about Punjabi. And most of my work now is in partition. My last two books and a forthcoming book, which is called Many Partitions.
Well, thank you very much for that. To the students out there, I will see you next week at the properly scheduled time at 2:30 p.m. And our last talk of the series next week will be with Professor Malia Bose on the art of the Singh twins and diasporic activism in the Punjabi migrant world. That is it. So thank you everybody for coming, and I'll ask the speaker just to stay on as we bid goodbye to everybody else.